Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the War of Ideas weekly shows every Monday night around 8, unless we have a guest. Today, I am not alone. Today, we have a guest. Now, it is not an interview guest because our lovely scheduler has been busy raising her family. However, we do have one of the best and brightest from the Pangburn server, who debatably is even better than some of the guests that I've talked to. We are going to be talking about a lot of different things today. We are going to be talking about the Israel-Palestine conflict because there's literally nothing else to talk about, but we're going to take all four approaches. We're going to talk about the conflict itself, the moral implications there, the moral implications of the issue writ large, because this was a debate long before Hamas did the attacks. We'll talk about what America's foreign policy should be, and then we'll talk about some of the reactions we've seen in the West, protest, stuff like that, and what that might indicate about our broader culture. And if somehow we manage to cover all of those things comprehensively in under an hour, as the talented people at the Pangburn server may be able to do, we will be talking about some other issues, generally political philosophy and things of that nature. Should be a good show. Looking forward to it. So without further ado, I welcome you again, one of Pangburn's best and brightest, Mr. Jonboy, who's happy to join me. Hello. How you doing, man?
What's up, buddy? How's it going?
It is going pretty good today. For whatever reason, Rumble is freaking out and we're not live streaming there. It is disconnected. I do not know why. I will
Oh
talk
no.
to people. Yeah, I know. YouTube still gets us though. And then and then once I publish this live stream as a video, then it will automatically publish to Rumble. So Rumble
Right.
doesn't get to enjoy us live, but I think they will survive. So Jonboy and I have known each other for like over 3.5 years through the server, longtime internet friends. So it's really good to talk to you, man. Glad we could bring you on. I'm probably going to be bringing you on more if you let me. How's that sound?
Awesome, man. No, good to be here. We've been talking about doing this for some time, so
Yeah.
no time's better
Okay.
than now.
Yeah. Better now than later. So Israel-Palestine conflict, for those who have been living under a rock and have not looked at the news in the last 4 weeks, what basically happened, I'm going to be as basic as possible, is that Hamas attacked Israel 3.5, 4 weeks ago, early in October. Um, they killed around 1,500 Israelis, many of which civilians, in the terroristic attack. They took over 200 hostages, some being Americans. And then Israel has been responding by bombing the hell out of Gaza in attempts to hit their terror tunnels. Unfortunately, on top of those terror tunnels is a population of 2 million civilians. Unfortunately, many of those civilians have also been brainwashed by Hamas ideology. At the same time, you have Iran, who is the state sponsoring Hamas. They also have proxies to the north in Hezbollah. I believe that Hezbollah is sponsored by Iran, although I wouldn't bet my life on it at this point because I don't remember. But Hezbollah is also getting frisky at the north. So while this conflict is really bad, Israel just started its ground invasion a couple of days ago. They're finally sending actual people in there. So they're risking their own troops now. While this conflict itself is bad, it is very frisky at the moment. This could expand regional, is what everybody seems to be worried about. But that is for the foreign policy conversation. So maybe we'll start foreign policy, and then maybe we'll get into the moral stuff a little bit later because we could talk about that forever. So, John
There
Boy, I'm
goes
curious
audio.
what you think about this. Do you think Israel is handling this correctly from a foreign policy perspective?
Oh no, I think I lost audio. Stand by.
Well, I can hear him. Um, Very sad. It's okay. You know what? Actually, we're going to start with the moral stuff because he didn't hear me say we were going to start with the foreign policy stuff. So, starting with the moral stuff, I mean, the big debate here in the States has been if Israel is in the right. Now, even before Israel responded, oh no, we lost him. He'll come back, I believe. Jonboy always comes back. Oops, hold on. Yeah. Okay. So even before Israel had its military response, where it was bombing people and bombing things, John Boy, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
All right, good.
Yeah. So I said we're going to start with the moral stuff, and it's interesting because the even before Israel started attacking back, even just in the wake of the Hamas attack, there was like moral debates about the status of the attacks. And we'll get to Israel's response as well because there's real debate there. It so we'll talk about that. But I'm curious, John Boy, for your take on the moral dynamics of this whole situation.
Oh man, it sucks. My take is it sucks. I don't think I have a hot take here. I think the sensible position for me seems to be, advocacy on behalf of people that are, I mean, I want to say the word innocent, which has its own kind of implications, but effectively, like I feel bad for people that are in Palestine that want nothing to do with this, didn't partake or advocate for any type of violence, and then now they're in a situation, for a variety of reasons, as far as I understand, all heavily caveated, where they're in deep trouble no matter what, right? At best in the short term, at worst in the long term, and then not to neglect the circumstances, right? What happened nearly a month ago now is tragic, horrific. I mean, pick your words to describe it. It's only reasonable to me that any group of people, nation state or otherwise, has the opportunity to defend themselves and their family from people that want to kill them.
Yeah.
So, I mean, morally, I mean, this is one of those situations where it feels like there is no, good outcome, in at least in the short term, right? The best outcome is the minimization of, unnecessary suffering. But, that's sort of stating the obvious.
Well, the question there is, what does that actually look like? Because the concern is, Israel pulled out of the Gaza strip in like 2005. Like Israel has not been running Gaza. Now they have been running the border because they're worried about suicide bombers and things like that. But they have not been governing Gaza for like over 15 years at this point, and yet Hamas is attacking them anyway. So I'm not really sure that there's a way. I don't think there's a way to allow Hamas to continue to exist and also minimize suffering. I think Hamas has to go. Um, so I'm
Yeah,
not
I mean, I think
sure.
when you have a group of people, and I'm going to suppose that I have a good understanding of what Hamas's intentions
Yeah,
are as an aggregate. If you have a group of people that are saying that, in order for us to be successful as a society, as a group, we need to eliminate these other people from existing, right? That's never going to work in the broader context. I think it's a flawed ideology, regardless of how justified people may feel based on historical context or otherwise. I just don't think that's a viable path forward. So if I'm Israel and there's a group of people that feel that way and they're willing to do stop at nothing in order to achieve that, then I need to defend myself.
yeah.
But it doesn't ignore the fact that I assume not everyone that resides within that territory feels the same way. And how do you protect them at the same time, right? I don't.
Well, there. I mean, Hamas is making it difficult. I mean, well, the first thing is that I think your point about the historical context is well taken. I remember originally after the event, I saw lots of people, including like professors, talking about how you can't demean people, you can't tell an oppressed class how they should be resisting, for example. Like that was the defense. And my response is, I sure as shit can. And the reason for that is because even if you buy the historical context, even if you buy that the state of Palestine has been put upon in some very serious way, and that Israel is a oppressor state, which we'll get to the truth of that claim eventually. Even if you believe that, that still doesn't justify what Hamas did, because Hamas wasn't going after military targets. They were intentionally targeting civilians, like old ladies and children and women. You don't rape women as a political point. You don't rape women over territorial disputes. You do that because fundamentally it's a religious conflict. So that was particularly shocking to me that you have that type of equivocation about the evil of a particular act on the basis of a political context, when the political context doesn't even necessitate those evil acts. Like if like I think it would have been bad if Hamas like started firebombing or missiling like IDF like military bases. I personally still think that would have been bad, but it would have been more defendable from the other side's position. So that's always been kind of concerning to me, is that type of knee jerk reaction. I'm kind of wondering where it's coming from. Uh, Curious for your thoughts there.
Yeah, I think there's validity to, like what Sam Harris had put out in terms of the sin of moral equivalence. I thought he did a good
Yeah.
job of speaking to that. And I think if you were to inspect the respective philosophies in terms of, what most Israelis believe or what most members of Hamas believe, you'd find a very different interpretation in terms of what the value of an individual life may be. Again, this is me speculating. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on this. So does that result in different actions that can be assessed morally in different ways? I think so, right? I think it's one thing to attack military targets. It's another thing to attack civilians. I think that's a clear moral distinction. But
Yeah.
I agree with what you said at the beginning, which is, do we have the ability to judge how people protest any perceived indiscretion, right? And I'm not an expert on, whether there was quote unquote an occupation or what the Israelis' role was in governing is probably the wrong word, governing what would happen in Gaza, but obviously they had an influence, right? Now the Gaza border is Israel on pretty
Mhm.
much all sides except for Egypt. So, I'm sure there are legitimate grievances by Palestinians that were in that territory prior to the attacks. And, if those grievances are legitimate and they feel like they don't have any recourse to respond, it's human nature is they're going to. And I'm not justifying that. I think it's horrific and it shouldn't happen that way. It seems to me, and I'm not a historian, but the peaceful style of protest, and I'm sure people will tell me because I'm ignorant on the topic that this is just not feasible or it was attempted and it wasn't successful. The
Mm.
peaceful style of protest, seems to be in hit when we look back on it in history, right? We remember the MLKs, the Nelson Mandelas, right? These advocates for peaceful change. I would hope that would be a circumstance that's achievable, but at least in terms of what it seems like in the Middle East, we continue to find ourselves in the situation where it's back and forth, violence, violence, violence.
Yeah, like, and if you look at the history, it's like Hamas is not interested. Like, this is something I've been hearing from the West. I've fundamentally, we're jumping all across the board, but talking about like the reaction of Western culture, I don't think like the West really understands that people don't want the same thing as them. Like,
Yeah,
Israel has offered Palestine and the Palestinian Authority, which was the governing body before Hamas, because Hamas was elected technically. Now, how fair those elections were, take it with a grain of salt. But um, Israel has offered peace deals like multiple times,
sure.
Like Israel would love nothing more than a two-state solution. Israel has tried to give the Gaza Strip to Jordan and to Egypt, and Jordan and Egypt are like, no, I don't want it. Like, Israel is not interested in running this part of the world. The reason that they have control over the borders is because they're trying to make sure that their people don't get killed.
Right.
At least that's the reason they give. If you want to say that like that's just a cover for some nefarious desire to keep these people in a open air prison, like you can speculate to that. I don't think that history or incentive structures support that idea, but sure. So but in the West, we keep calling for a two-state solution. I feel like Hamas, which is the governing body of Palestine, has just made it abundantly clear that they're just not interested. And if that's the case, there is literally nothing to do other than get rid of Hamas and hope that the Palestinian people create a new governing committee that is interested in peace. Like, I'm not really sure what other option there is on the table for Israel.
Yeah,
Um,
what do you do when you have and I'm not saying this is the case, right? But if you had millions of people that would all die before allowing someone else to exist,
yeah,
is war the only option?
I mean,
I
I
would
think
hope
so.
not,
I
right?
mean,
I would hope there's some type of an educational process. There's a way that human beings, right? And I'm not saying. I think you made a good point, right? I forget what it's called in psychology. Is the fundamental attribution error, where like we falsely believe that other people have the
yeah,
same
it's because we're
feel.
spoiled and coddled in the West. We don't know how
Spoil
to
what
live yet.
we just I think we perceive the world through our own lens, whatever that
Yeah,
lens may be, right? And in the
yeah,
West, obviously, with this affluence, so we look at, but we all do this. I think it's a human thing. We just have our own
yeah.
kind of vantage point in the West. But I agree with some of your criticism of the way the West is reacting. I suspect that's where you're going, but you know,
Yeah, yeah. It's very strange. It's very, I don't know, almost childlike. Like, we keep wanting to say that it's a political and territorial issue, and it is like kinda, but I think fundamentally it's just, I think that we're just looking at a holy war, to be honest with you. Like, these cultures are different. They like
I
one of
mean,
them wants the other one to go away.
you've seen some of those videos, right? Who knows what's real, right? But they're like it's a snapshot of like children being
Yeah, yeah,
interviewed, talking about
yeah.
how they hate as Jews, and it's like these, I don't want to say they don't even have a chance, but it's like you
They
know,
don't.
what do they know, right? So then you grow up indoctrinated in a society that like encourages you to view these other people as less than human, right? We've seen all
Mhm.
this before, and the manifestation of that when they become adults going, I mean, it doesn't seem like a very hard thing to predict if that's the culture.
Right. So again, this is why Israel should do everything it can to protect Palestinian civilians. But the issue is that they're sending in their ground troops now, so it's getting to kind of a Black Hawk Down situation where it's going to be like damn near impossible to know who is a civilian and who's not. And because many civilians are like believe what Hamas believes, right? And so it like very
They
Black
could be
Hawk Down.
sympathetic but not supportive or not
Yeah,
militant. I
well, and
mean,
they might not be supportive until they see the IDF, walking down the street and Hamas propaganda, you know, has them interpret that in a particular way. Like it's really really ugly. And so this kind of brings me to the second point is that um you've also heard a lot in the West that is there's a level of moral equivalence. Is that what you've heard? And one of the reasons you've heard that is because Israel's bombing has been taking out civilians. Now, not as many as Hamas would have you believe. If you guys all remember last week, Hamas blamed a missile exploding in a hospital, said it killed 500 people. They said it was from Israel. Not true. It was one of their missiles. It landed in a parking lot. It maybe killed 5 people. So, that's number one. But yes, Israel, there have been casualties. And I want to hear what you think about this because it's actually kind of more of a moral philosophy type of thing. Is personally, I do think moral intent matters. First of all, every single civilian who is killed, absolute tragedy, should do everything you can try to do to prevent it. Israel is doing things to prevent it. They're turning off water and electricity in the north, and they're turning them on in the south. They're texting people to get them to leave. But I do think that there's a difference between a civilian getting killed because you explicitly targeted them and tried to kill them versus a civilian getting killed after you tried to get them out of the way, but they remain because Hamas is using them as a human shield. I think those two deaths are the people have similar moral weight. The civilians who have moral weight who die have the exact same moral weight, but the moral character of the actions leading to their deaths are not the same. I do not think those are the same thing. But the West seems to believe that it's basically all the same. That all this, they're like, look how Israel has killed more civilians than Hamas did. Now, again, I don't know if you can believe those numbers, but even if you did, I don't think it's just a numbers game. The reason those civilians died actually matters, at least to me. But I'm curious where you are on this because I've talked to like all out utilitarians who see no distinction. So I'm
No,
curious.
from a moral philosophy standpoint, I absolutely believe that intent matters. I mean, I just think that's sort of implicit in the notion of morality is a degree of agency, right? If there's no agency, then where's the culpability? And we not to go down
Real.
the determinism path, right? But like to the extent to which we conceive of it. So I agree that you can make those evaluations based on intent and all those sort of circumstances that you just described. Where I kind of get lost is like, I wouldn't say because Hamas did this, now I'm on the side of the Israelis, right? I think you sort of just have this like trap of just like picking sides in this like conflict, and like to me it just seems far more complicated than that. Like is Israel like 70% right and Hamas is it 70-30 Israel? Like, I think the focus really just needs to be on, trying to achieve the best possible outcome. And I think what happens a lot of times in these circumstances is we resort to our more human tendencies, which is like, you killed my family and now I'm going to exact revenge. And both sides end up saying the same thing sort of in perpetuity.
Yeah.
And, I
I
think
will say though that I will say though that unfortunately it does look like the you killed my like I do like as we talked about I think the best possible scenario is just getting rid of Hamas just completely and totally. So in this instance, the revenge motive might actually align with the path to the best possible outcome.
Yeah,
Strangely,
I may be an idealist, but like in an ideal sense, like as a global community, we find the conflict that exists, and I'm not ignoring the rest of the conflicts that exist throughout the world, but like this Middle Eastern conflict has been going on as far as I've been alive,
Mhm.
right? And as a global community, in many ways, we've moved past certain tribal tendencies, and again, maybe I'm being too idealistic, but like there, in my mind, somehow there's got to be a creative solution which helps people learn to maybe see things in a better way, right? And maybe it's not this generation, maybe it's not the next generation, but is the generation after that, or do we just like continue to do this?
Well, I would say that any attempt at like re-education isn't going to be made possible by the people in charge because again, the people in charge don't want it to be possible. Also, I think it'd be called like cultural imperialism by the lefties at home as well. So your solution is imperialistic and bad, John Boy. That's a joke. Straw man was for comedic purposes, although holds a lot of truth. But we kind of had something close to this with the Abraham Accords. And basically, the idea was just create unified economic pressure. The idea was basically just get all of the Arab states to be on Israel's side instead of Palestine's side. Like, just get Saudi Arabia to be friends with Israel because the U.S. was friends with Israel. And if you do that for long enough, and you have basically the coalition of the Middle East being united and cool, all except for Palestine, that eventually that type of just economic and cultural pressure will work. We lost John Boy. That is so sad. Well, anyway, that was the idea of the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords were quickly undone because Joe Biden's an idiot. And that was undone. He started paying money to Iran again. And a lot of the progress there. Oh, he's back. Wonderful.
Blip.
What was the last thing you heard?
Coalition in the Middle East. You're on.
Yeah. So basically, the idea was you build a coalition in the Middle East of all the Arab states and make, basically just present a united front in the Middle East of basically Israel and all the other Arab states versus again and Palestine, and then hopefully the long-standing pressure from that would eventually work. But I don't know if that's true. If anything, I think it has just as large a chance, if not a larger chance, of just driving Hamas into further radicalism. Of saying like, oh, look how the Jews control the world. Look how they hypnotize our the other Arab states. We must fight even harder. I don't know, man. From historical precedent, I don't think Hamas can be allowed to continue to exist. I don't see a way to do that.
No, I listen. If your philosophy is, again, I was sort of alluding back to an earlier point. If your philosophy is such that in order for you to survive, this other group of people needs to no longer survive, based purely on the fact that they are of a particular heritage or whatever, then those two things will not exist at the same time, right?
Right.
I mean, and that will resolve itself one way or another. Now, the optimist in me would hope that you could change the minds of people that are so blinded in that sense, but I understand that it's not always feasible. So,
Yeah.
But that would be where my hope would be. Obviously,
Sure.
practically, it's a whole different concept.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the game plan is really just take out Hamas, and then Israel can't just take over because the international community would have a fit. Because that's not a thing that can happen, and potentially rightly so. Although I actually do think there's a colorable debate there, which means they probably just kill the leadership and then leave, and then just see what rises next and hope it's more interested in peace, and just hope that it's not another violent organization, which it definitely will be. But
And it'll be on the heels of a major military defeat.
right,
I mean, when
exact.
does that usually doesn't seem to work out well.
Right. So then we just repeat this. So then what? We just repeat the cycle forever? Is that like Israel tries to keep them contained? They try to protect itself. They don't want to get involved. They try to keep it contained until eventually something big enough breaks through that they have to go in, kill all the leaders, let them rebuild, hope they rebuild in a way for peace. And then that doesn't happen. And then we do it again. Like, is that looks like the pattern that's emerging here. I don't really.
And this is I mean, again, humans have been doing this for a really long time, right? And if I tend to try to think about it in the context of like where I live, which is in the U.S. If Mexico was Gaza and we're the U.S. and just they're firing rockets over a fence continuously, despite whatever the circumstances are, like the U.S. would not allow that to continue to exist, right? It's there's an asymmetric advantage currently in terms of firepower, and we'd say, listen, you have to stop bombing us, or we're going to remove you and occupy your land. I imagine that's what the U.S. would do in that circumstance. So
Yeah.
I get it. I get it.
Well, a big part of the humanitarian crisis right now is that Hamas has and admittedly does basically uses civilians as human shields, right? It has terror tunnels on the cities. It has they put their ammunitions inside of mosques. They have their base underneath a hospital, and they do it specifically because it keeps Israel from hitting on them. And when they do hit them, because they have to, it's good propaganda opportunities. And the amount of people I've seen in the West fall for this is insane. They're like, "Oh my God, Israel blew up a mosque." And I'm like, they never ask why. They just assume cartoonish villain motives. Like, the other side would say I'm assuming cartoonish villain motives for Hamas, but I have really, really good evidence because they say it's openly and explicitly. Um, so the humanitarian crisis is really bad. Israel's trying to get people to leave, but Egypt won't really take refugees, and neither will Jordan. And there's not a lot of room to go. Um, I mean, I don't know. To my mind, like I want to know what you think about this in terms of the moral calculus. In my mind, it's more Hamas when Palestinian civilians die due to Israeli rockets. My blame goes more towards Hamas than it really goes towards Israel. I'm curious for where your thoughts on this too. And like I'm uncomfortable saying that because my natural inclination is to try to see try to have a balanced position and to try to like not be really favoring one side too heavily. But it's just the facts on the ground kind of make it inescapable for me. So I'm curious if you think that that's a little too far or not.
I mean, too far. Blame is a tricky one. It's like, okay,
Yeah.
how far back do we go? Where do we end up pointing
Well,
the
if you go
finger?
all
And
the
then
way back to like biblical times,
yeah, do we arrive at like one group where, okay, it's all your fault? Like,
yeah,
like yes, we've arrived. It's all your fault. Now what? Right? So like, is it wrong for for Hamas to use Palestinian citizens as shield? Of course, that's wrong. Is Israel doing everything they can to protect themselves? Without being reckless with the lives of other people that Hamas is using, irresponsibly, horribly. The blame thing is very difficult. You
I
know,
think so. The only thing that I've seen out of Israel that has concerned me is apparently they were using white phosphorus,
I
which
saw
is
that.
not
Yeah,
something you're supposed to do.
yeah,
So if that's, I don't know how true that is. I don't know what their justification for this was. I looked into it and I couldn't find anything. So that's very concerning. But again, um,
yeah.
other than
And
that,
this is just the stuff we know about, right? I mean,
right,
this
right, right, right.
billions and billions of dollars that go into these war machines, and this, my opinion is just being a casual observer that just there's so little that we actually know. If we
Oh,
got
it's
to see
propaganda.
everything, it's like okay, all right, maybe one piece of information can change the moral calculus in terms of blame very easily, and there's so
Yeah.
much information we don't know. So
Yeah, the propaganda war is insane. Like this is if you look just looking across social media, just seeing the propaganda war is wild. Like from
yeah,
Hamas and from Israel, because Israel puts out stuff that's like not true. Like I forget. I have to give. Israel has put stuff that is not true out before, and I'm
sure.
sure they're doing it again now. And
They had that
people
one video
also,
they posted where the timestamp
yeah,
on the video was like in the future. I
yeah,
mean, but
yeah,
this is tactical, right? I'm not like,
right, 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 and that's the point
governments lie
too.
to people. Okay,
People
everybody
assume
sit
too
down.
much there.
Right.
People assume too much there that because they're saying something untrue with their propaganda, therefore that's because they're hiding the fact that they're the bad guy, and that is not correct. Propaganda war goes along with every war. Is it good? Not really. But does engaging in fake propaganda make you the bad guy automatically? Absolutely not. And that's true for Israel and that's true for Hamas. Hamas is the bad guy for other reasons. It's not because their propaganda is fake. Because their propaganda isn't all true. Like that's not why. But I've been noticing this as
Yeah.
an argument I see a lot. I see it's like, oh, look how Israel lies about this, and it's like, well, yes, it's wartime. It's
All
propaganda.
large
Regulations.
organizations lie. I mean,
Yeah,
put a bunch of people together, give them responsibility, authority, and power. They're going to lie to maintain perceptions. I mean, it's just,
yeah.
it seems like 100%.
Right, right,
I
right,
mean, name
right.
one large entity that's never lied. Uh, you know.
None, none. This show. How about that? This,
Yeah. I think honestly, this whole like the whole like podcast to stand or however it's referred to, it kind of inspires faith and authenticity, and I think there's a lot of
yeah,
advocates for that do
yeah.
similar shows. That's great.
Yeah. So if you, I mean, I don't want to go into the history. We did that on the Royal Rumble last week. So if you're interested in that, Royal Rumble, we talked about the history more in depth. But the last thing I want to talk about regarding this is what America's foreign policy should be, because people have wild disagreements, including on the right. The right is having a civil war about this. There's two civil wars on the right. There is a cultural civil war between spiritual conservatives and like kind of Nietzschean conservatives, and then there's like the kind of manifest political war, which does not actually line up with the cultural war in the same way, which I kind of wish it did, but it doesn't. And that's between like just kind of more there's like three camps. Like the moderates are gone, by the way. Like Mitt Romney's faction of republicanism isn't really in power anymore. It's now between the people who were more traditional right and now the people who are like Trump right. So it's like traditional, actually conservative versus Trump conservative, and like the moderates have been pushed out of relevance. So there's like a war going on the right, including over this issue, over whether foreign policy should be towards Israel. But before we get there, there's a comment. H. Guiman, he says, not a life necessarily need to know basis. I don't know what that means. You're gonna have to specify, my friend. I am sorry, but I'm curious. What is your if you were Joe Biden, minus the dementia and minus like 50 years? What would your foreign policy be regards to Israel?
If I was Joe
Not a
Biden,
lie necessarily a need to
I'd be
know
retired.
basis in regards to propaganda, says H. Guiman. Yeah, sure. I tend to agree that there's a distinction there. Okay, yes. What is your foreign policy in the Situation Room?
If I'm Joe Biden, I'd be retired, hanging out with my family,
Okay.
and I would have given up on politics some time ago. But if I'm me and I'm in Joe Biden's chair,
Yes, you are the designated survivor for some reason, and everyone else is dead. So it's
yeah,
false.
and I am not an expert on foreign diplomacy, but I do believe that let's say I was more exposed to this. There's probably some strategic advantages to maintaining allied relationships on an international stage, and obviously Israel is a strong ally of the U.S. and has been for a very very long time. So I think my role as president in that situation would be we need to support our allies as best we can, but we also need to be an advocate for humanitarian causes. We need to be able to justify that we're doing everything we can to protect innocent lives, and I that's with full knowledge that innocent people will die, like no matter what that's going to happen. But
Mhm.
we need to be able to both look ourselves in the face and then advocate to our constituents that this is what we're doing to help with that. And again, I mean, I think was it Kirby came out the other day, and he gave sort of a very matter of fact like interview when the interviewer asked her, isn't it horrific like these things are happening? And I'm not a huge fan of all of his statements, but he came out and was like, yeah, this is horrific, and so is all of this, and war is messy, and shit's gonna suck, and that was kind of the message, which fair enough, you know. But I think
Yeah.
that you should be focused on what your goal is, right? Your goal is to eliminate the threat and preserve innocent life. Right? If those are your goals and you make decisions through that perspective,
Do you think those should be America's goals?
I think there this goes kind of back to what I started with is I think there's a benefit on a global stage for supporting your allies. Now you
Right.
have to balance both those international priorities with your domestic priorities, and for those most of us here, there's a strong belief that like our domestic priorities are in trouble, right?
Yeah,
If
it's
in a
really,
lot of ways.
really bad. Yeah.
So I don't, in these situations, I don't think there are necessarily good solutions. I think there's just trade-offs. So you
Well,
have
where
to
is the
figure out.
balance? Well, first of all, love the quote, no solutions, only trade-offs. Very true. But second, the my question is how far does that go? Because like American boots on the ground are you that far or you just send lots of money? What do you think?
Yeah, it seems we've been pretty effective so far at providing intelligence. I think is a big piece of it. But
To be
then
fair, Israel does not need our help with intelligence, but
I think the combined knowledge is
yeah.
helpful, right? Apparently they do, right? I mean, and I'm not saying we would have been any better had we been
Oh yeah,
directly.
yeah. That's there's been conspiracy theories about that actually. I mean, my
Sure.
personal theory is that they were warned about it, I think, but I think they just wrote it off because Hamas is not particularly technologically sophisticated, so they just didn't care. And then all of a sudden, this particular attack was planned by Iran as well, and therefore was sophisticated. So they weren't surprised by the attack, but just by its effectiveness. But other people have like put forward the conspiracy that it was like false flag, that it's just like an excuse for Israel to go in and like just destroy Gaza, which
Whenever there's an
is
incident
a theory.
before a large like wartime activity set of activities, there's always going to be considerations as to whether or not this was an intelligence failure or whether or not things were allowed to happen, right? Vis-a-vis 9/11 and a lot of there's many circumstances, and in some cases there's evidence to suggest that that's true. Now I have no I'm so far removed from what the reality of the situation likely is, just as an individual citizen living in the United States, that I can barely speculate. I don't have enough evidence to support any particular theory, but it happened, right? So now war will
Yeah,
happen. What back to the question of like what is the US's role? I think,
yeah,
providing intelligence is an easy step. I would do everything I could not to put boots on the ground. I mean, again, Israel in this case, they have an asymmetric advantage.
yeah. They don't need
So
help.
I'm not saying they. Yeah, again, this escalates beyond what we're seeing right now, and you have neighboring regions start to get involved in the conflict, which I obviously hope doesn't happen. That puts us in a much more difficult situation.
Yeah, I've actually I'm gonna get crucified by the people who are a little bit to my right about this. I'm actually like kind of impressed with how Biden has handled this. Not in terms of his rhetoric, because his rhetoric is like very mishmash moral equivalent stuff. Overall, as far as
He
I can
doesn't really
tell,
say anything. He's kind of
yeah. I mean, but that's
rhetoric is
just
pretty good.
well, that's I can't even blame Joe Biden for that. That's just what like every president except for
Yeah,
Trump
yeah, 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 yeah.
forever. Trump was the only guy who wouldn't do that, but Trump was out of his mind in a good way sometimes, but sometimes in a good way, not always in a good way. But what he did was he sent some aircraft. He sent like big ass aircraft carriers over there, basically just as a threat, just to make sure that it doesn't spin up into a regional thing. Because I think that's the real worry. I think like if you keep Israel and Hamas more accurately
Hmm.
in a cage, and you just keep them in a cage and you watch them fight, Israel will just take out Hamas. I think that that's what will happen. The concern is that like if Hezbollah comes in from the north and then like maybe and then if two front war there, then Israel gets stretched and we don't know what they'll do. Maybe they'll use nukes. Like if they're under existential threat, like Hamas and Hezbollah do not want Israel to exist anymore. So if they get overstretched, then they'll have to carpet bomb with their air force, and if that happens, then maybe Syria and Iran get in, and if that happens, maybe you have to use nukes. So what America seems to be doing, which I kind of like, is just peace through strength, which is just I send an air force carrier over there, I shoot down some missiles, and I'm just like, hey, I will turn you into a parking lot if you invade Israel. You do not want to do this. Just and people on my right who are like isolationists think that's a war hawk move. I don't think that's true. I think if anything, an attempt to limit the violence and limit the involvement that America is going to have by keeping the conflict small, by playing prevent defense instead of very expensive red zone defense after the situation is out of hand. Um, I don't know. That's kind of my take on it. But I am sympathetic to the isolationist position though. In
I am
terms,
too. Yeah, especially if you start to factor in some of the challenges the U.S. has had in waging wars
right,
overseas,
right,
right?
yeah,
I mean, it's we've had very public sort of
lessons,
issues, right? I mean, and I'm not
lessons.
blaming any one individual. I think it's so easy to just say, "Oh, you were the president at the time; it's all
It
your
was
fault." I
Bush.
mean,
I mean,
sure, it all rolls up, like that's fine, but like these are hundreds of thousands of people that are organizing these things, and most people have been part of large organizations before. Dysfunction is endemic, and that's true in the private sector. It's true in the government. So I'm not one to just point a finger at one or a small group of people. But regardless, I think the goal needs to be de-escalation. It needs to be to slow things down, right? That would be my goal, and I
well,
agree with what you said,
mhm.
right? Because if I'm Israel, am I under threat of being attacked in Tel Aviv today or on the homeland? To a certain extent, maybe from individuals or isolated terrorists, maybe some coordinated efforts. But it seems like they've got the advantage right now. So if we can just go slower, right? And let's assume they're.
We lost him again. No, tragic. John Boy seemed to be talking about trying to wind down into a ceasefire. I'm not sure that I buy that. I think honestly, I think that they need to. I mean, we'll talk about when it gets here, but I think a ceasefire just delays the issue, right? It just allows Hamas to exist, and it allows Hamas to, scheme to attack Israel again. That's all that's going to happen. A ceasefire just means that Israel does not do its duty to avenge its people, and it does not do its duty to defend its people, because by allowing Hamas to exist, you are virtually guaranteeing future civilian deaths. That's what you're doing. Um, so I, I don't know if he's calling for a ceasefire, so I'm going to say that to him when he comes back. It's very sad that he's gone. I'm very sad about this. So yeah, that's kind of where we're at. We got 3 whole viewers. I think that's the best we've ever had. 3 whole viewers.
Winning.
By the way, that sounds very hippie of you. It sounds
I'm
like
in
you're
character.
winding down. I mean, wind down to a ceasefire. Is that the idea? Because I've been calls for ceasefire have been a thing.
Listen,
Um,
I'll
I don't love
quote
this thing. for
I'll
the rest
quote
of it.
Trump, right? Because we're on Rumble.
Yes.
And I thought
We're actually technically not, but we will be.
he had a fair point. He's like, I want less people dying.
I want everyone to stop dying.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. This is ridiculous, right? Like, I'm not supposed, it's not a political statement, but it's just, I mean, that you asked me like what my interest would be is,
Mhm.
as few people dying as possible.
I mean, I don't think that analogy works, to be honest with you. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, I think Israel has the ability and the duty to avenge its people, and it definitely has the moral and it definitely has the technical obligation to defend its people.
What do you mean by avenge?
I mean, you killed innocent civilians, therefore I'm going to destroy you, evil
Do
Hamas terrorists.
Sure. Okay, so right, anybody who would say I am Hamas, Israel should kill them.
Um, See, that's difficult because I think there's a lot of civilians who have been brainwashed who have not actually done any violence
This
who
is where
would
I'm
call
going. Yeah,
themselves
right.
Hamas. I think that we can. I don't think it's too hard to draw distinctions between who are Hamas, like fighting age male Hamas militants who have actually been involved versus like brainwashed people who will just say that.
I
I
think
think
that's very hard, but if you've got a machine to do that, that'd be
no,
fantastic.
I'm not saying that you'll be able to do it perfectly. I think you'll be able to
Mm.
do it to the point where the slippery slope argument doesn't really work.
Sure.
My point is basically to say that a ceasefire now just guarantees Hamas attacks later. That's kind of my point. Like, I think not just so avenging is one thing, but avenging isn't really the killing argument. The killing argument is a defense thing. Like, if Israel does not destroy Hamas, Hamas will attack Israel again because
Right.
all of history has taught us this. So
That's
it's
why
yeah,
I would be more comfortable with the phrasing that Israel has an obligation to defend itself as opposed to avenge itself. Now, again, I'm not trying
well,
to.
it's both, in my
Yeah,
mind. But testosterone.
I got you. Listen, I mean, if I'm on the front lines, we're going to avenge our fallen comrades.
Yeah,
I like, you know what I mean? Like, I get it. I get it.
yeah.
It's just,
Um, Yeah, but the point is that like I don't know. I don't know if the slow down idea is the good idea. I think the idea is you just have America keep the cage locked and Israel just go as fast and hard as humanly possible to get rid of Hamas while avoiding taking out civilians and then reconsolidates. Because right now when it's in attack mode, it's vulnerable to other fronts getting
Yeah,
invaded.
my only concern with that strategy it's a footnote, right? While trying to protect civilians, right? It's like I'm not. There's a balance here that should be
Yeah.
struck, and I don't know what it is, right? Because if there was another horrific attack in Israel, that's gonna start putting more weight on the side of like we just
Well,
got to get in
it
there and
will
kill
happen. Like if
everybody.
Hamas is allowed to continue to
Yeah.
exist, it will happen, and Israel will have failed in basically the primary purpose of the government existing, of more specifically of Israel existing, because
But let's
Israel
fast
is
forward, right? So like let's say they destroy Hamas, they win.
yes,
Whatever that means. There's
yeah,
millions of people dead. There's like 50 people left that are
millions.
Palestinians. Whatever, right? So whatever the
Oh,
success
I'm thinking a few
criteria
thousand.
is. Like
But
then what? Like will Israel never be attacked again? I mean, it's just
no, it
it's
might.
like
It's a hurt.
it's going it seems like it's as long as the ideology is such, this is going to perpetuate for forever.
Well, this
So
argument sounds like you just want Israel to take over because, like, Israel has tried to give it away to other groups and they've tried to strike peace deals. The hope is just that a peaceful government will rise in Hamas's place who wants to like be left alone. I don't think that's going to happen. The argument to break the cycle of violence that you seem to be proposing, or that I think is made necessary by your desire, is for Israel to basically just take over, and just say,
yeah, I
you know what,
don't.
us now.
Unfortunately, I don't think it can be Israel. But if I'm just thinking
No
creatively,
one else will do it. Like Israel, like Jordan and Egypt don't want it, and like the UN can't run it. The UN peacekeepers are absolute monsters, by the way.
but I mean, and I'm not saying there is an existing bureaucracy today that's capable of it. But it
Yeah.
seems like, as far as I can tell, there's a lot of people on this earth that want to defend this group of people, right?
Mhm.
So with that combined motivation and their respective political authority somehow we need to come up with a constitution, a set of agreement treaty, right? This is how we all agree on peace, that says in this location these people can reside and under these circumstances, and whenever the dust settles, right? This is whenever is everybody thinks they're safe enough to make this type of decision, and then there's got to be some type of governing authority, and maybe that's not going to come from inside this particular region, but some coalition, hopefully would say we agree to these terms based on this, and everybody we can police our nation and we can secure our borders to whatever, however those are defined, in an effort to keep you safe and us safe, because we want people to stop dying. And
I don't think that's
this is
true
the
though.
agreement.
Like, here's the thing: Israel wants people to stop dying. To be honest, from the evidence I've seen, Hamas does not care if its civilians keep dying. I think that they put like from the evidence, I don't think they care. Otherwise, one of the other 4 or 5 peace treaties that have been offered before would have gotten signed instead of being turned down flat. Many of
Yeah,
which included
if
land accessions. Like,
yeah, I agree. I fully concede, right? And this goes back to the earlier point. If there are a group of people that will not exist as long as these other people do exist, that's going to sort itself out in a human way, right? So if
that's what I'm saying.
Hamas
I'm saying they
says,
should sort it out ASAP. That's my point. Like,
well, yeah, the ASAP just includes some component of collateral damage that I'm trying to mitigate. So if my intuition is
well, let
if
me let me rephrase then. As soon as they should do it as quickly as humanly possible without increasing the risk of collateral damage, whatever that
oh
looks like.
yeah, then I totally agree with
Yeah,
you. But
yeah,
all the
whatever
devils
that
are in
looks
all the
like, then
details
it's
there.
fine. And then like ideally, if you want my foreign policy perspective, you do that. America flexes its muscles in order to keep this from spinning into a multi-front and then regional and then potentially nuclear war, which sucks for everybody, America included. That does not make me a hawk. Shut up to people on my right. But so that happens. Take out Hamas, leave Palestine alone to rebuild. All of the aid comes flooding in, as it will, to try to rebuild. And then you spin up the Abraham Accords again that Biden pulled out on because he's an idiot. Recreate that coalition, and then just pray that since Palestine is reforming and that every single country, including the Arab countries around them, are part of an economic beneficial coalition, that eventually they will start to soften out a bit. There's like a 20% chance that that works. I think it's much more likely that
I
that will
think you're
not work.
optimistic. Yeah, based
Yeah,
on
20% is
historical.
optimistic,
Yeah.
because we saw when we opened up China that trade doesn't actually change culture. Libertarians like to say this, that like you can't go to war with people you trade with, and that like all like the cultural differences will go away. That is not true. Opening up China to trade proved it. So there's like a very low chance that that will work, but I don't see an option with a better strategy other than like Palestine not being self-determining anymore and an outside entity coming in and ruling it. And but that also sounds really bad, and also every single person on the left in the West will cry bloody murder as a return of imperialism. um
Yeah, I mean, when I saw that poll, I think Travis had put it out, where it was trying to compare 1939 Germany with the Israeli state now, and I think 10%. Who knows if they're bots? I guess whatever. But
Probably not.
if let's assume for a moment, for the sake of discussion, that it's accurate. If 10% of people seem to believe that the modern day Israeli government is worse than Nazi Germany at its effectively at its peak,
Yeah, that's because you're insane.
I just, I have to believe there's a degree of cognitive dissonance there, right? No human is adequately conceptualizing both scenarios. I think
No.
it's an ideology that you've embraced, which,
Yep.
okay, but that can be taught, right? You can have a conversation about that in theory.
Yeah. We had an interesting talk about this on the Royal Rumble, not last weekend, but the weekend before. I missed the Royal Rumble on Sunday because I was busy. Sorry, guys. I know you missed me. But the 2 weeks ago, we talked about this, and we talked about how Israel is technically an apartheid state. So I'm curious for your take on this. So Israel is a Jewish state, and what that means is that if you're an ethnic Jew, from the way that they do ancestry, you have automatic citizenship. Now, 20% of the Israeli population is Arab. There are Arabs in high office, including the Supreme Court, although, and the Supreme Court is like, whatever. The politics of how Israel works are weird. But anyway, like there are Arabs living there and they have equal rights as far as I'm aware. There might be some like very mild exceptions regarding like churches, I think. But as far as I'm aware, it's mostly just a citizenship thing. Technically, the fact that ethnic Jews get automatic citizenship makes Israel an apartheid state, which is not what I think of or necessarily even care about when I hear the word apartheid. But I am curious for your take on that in terms of morality, like how you feel about Israel's favoring of Jews in that way, because that's what it exists for. It exists to prevent shit like this from happening anymore, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I guess
Technically, it's discriminatory. Technically,
I get lost in these words, man, because it's like it becomes semantics at some level and say, are you an apartheid state or are you not? Is that racist? Is that not racist? And like everybody has their own definition depending upon how they're trying
Well,
to
that's why I
express
gave you the
it.
description to decide if
Yeah.
you give a shit.
Yeah. I mean, if you are ethnically Jewish and that grants you some citizen, state status as a citizen, that's a Israeli governance decision. Does that make it an apartheid state? At least in terms of what I would think of when I think of apartheid?
Yeah,
No, no, of
no,
course, no.
I agree.
Think
I
of
don't think
South
it's
Africa, right? I think when
right.
I
Right.
think of
I
apartheid.
don't think there's any moral equivalence from the policies that I'm aware of in Israel. Again, I could
And I
be
am so misinformed, so underinformed on this that it's
the policies I'm aware of. It's extremely light, and there's no there's no like violation or holding back of rights from non-Jews. I think the only thing is that like there's like slight benefits to ethnic Jews, but everybody has basic human rights across the board. I don't see that as remotely morally equivalent to the type of
Listen, and you know this, right? Because like if you think about it in the U.S. context, right, there's legal equivalence, and then there's cultural equivalence, there's socioeconomic equivalence, I mean, so you could all of the laws could theoretically be equal for all people, but the interpretation of those laws based on the fact that there's an overwhelming majority of the people of a certain type in positions of authority legally or otherwise. I mean, how that
yeah,
plays out in practice can be very different even if
yeah.
the laws.
And I think that I don't know if I even renamed this stream. I'm a bad person. Um, yeah. So what I think here is that I think there's an open question as to the right civil war about Israel. I kind of want to talk about this just for the last 10 minutes here. It's interesting. You said something about how Israel is a very strong ally to America. The Trumpy people on the right, and that's not a derogatory term actually, but just for the record, are not convinced that Israel is actually that strong of an ally. They see it as much more of a one-way relationship. Now, I think this is probably true, but that's true for every relationship America has with any other country, is that it's very one-sided. And I actually tend to agree that we need to renegotiate our deals. That's why I kind of disagree with your conception of the foreign policy here. Like America is not involved because like Israel is just such a net benefit to America. America's involved, one, a little bit just because moral stuff, but two, because if this spins into a larger war, that's bad for America. And it's just
Correct.
like a pure, I think you can make like a pure realist case in terms of foreign policy for like flexing our muscles with some aircraft carriers in the Red Sea. So that's number one. But number two, and this is a more interesting point, is that I think a lot of reason why people want to defend Israel so hard, besides the moral stuff, just on like a Western cultural level, is that it seems to be this seems to be representative of a larger conflict, which is not Israel versus Palestine, but it's just like the West versus activists who think the West is bad. Like, is the West good or bad? Should the West be pushed to the side? Is it evil and colonial, imperialist, and oppressive, or is it not? And I think that the Israel Palestine conflict has basically just been the spark and a physical representation of this larger cultural battle that we're seeing now. Do you think I'm crazy? And I'm curious if you agree, and I'm curious what you think about that kind of idea. Because I think that's part of where a lot of the defense from Israel is coming from, is that, and I think it's a lot of where the disregard for Palestinian um, activists is coming from, is that it's not that like you think Palestine has had a hard time, it's that you think the West overall is just evil, and therefore we're opposed. I think that that's the underlying issue here. But I'm curious if you think I'm reading into it too much, or if I'm not, or what do you think?
When I look at the funhouse mirror that is social media,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, I tend to get that reflection, right? But I have a hard
Funhouse.
time gauging how real that is, right? When I talk to people in real life, like I'd get a different version of people. But again, I'm not the sample size is terrible, and I'm just having conversations
Mhm.
where I let. But let's say I take the social media reaction for what it's worth, right? And you've got kind of this weird reaction that's going on college campuses where seemingly left individuals have more sympathy towards the Palestinian cause as opposed to the Israeli cause that seems to be tied to some type of notion of Western imperialism. Again, these are common themes that are kind of just like that
And again, it's really
presented
not.
to
They
me on
haven't.
Twitter.
Yeah.
You know,
And again, it's really not. Israel has not been in charge of the Gaza Strip. They have been managing imports and out exports because they're worried about terrorism correctly. They have not had a governmental presence in the Gaza Strip since 2005. To put that out there one more fucking time, that's not a thing that's been true ever.
Yeah, and I've heard. Yeah, I listened to Barry Weiss. You know, I'm a fan of hers. I think she's a good journalist. Obviously, she sort of has her perspective. I try to kind of get it all sides. I don't think there's two
Yeah.
sides, right? There's like multiple different views. So and not to go back down the rabbit hole of like whether or not Israel was having, there were oppressive elements of the Israeli government having an influence over the lives of people in Gaza, right? Because I think that's the open question to a certain extent with respect.
Well, to some extent, I mean, to some extent, they have like they're limiting trade, right? Like, so to a certain extent, yeah.
Right. Yeah. So these are
But
contributing to
why?
legitimate
Yeah.
grievances on
But
that
why
side.
were they doing that? Because they're suicide bombers. Like,
Yeah, it's not two dimensional, right? This is
right.
it's multi-dimensional. This is why I don't have, when I see people that are just overreacting, is like the hating of the West is like this, where it's just bad or good. Like nothing is that simple, right? The US sends tons of money and aid all over the world, right? Is that bad or good? Do they do it for good reasons or not? Have they also gotten involved in wars and operated in places and done things that they, of course, yeah, absolutely. It's not, it's just that I kind of reject the whole premise of like good guys, bad guys, West bad, right? So if
Well,
you're
I
in
don't
that
think
camp, I'm like, I don't
we
know.
have to be careful though, because I understand that it's complicated. I would not reject the idea of good guys and bad guys though, and the reason for that is because I think the moral relativism is the worst sin of all here. I do think that one of these parties is not perfect or as clean as the Germans. Oh, and he's gone. God damn it. Okay, he'll come back. We're in the last 5 minutes here. Mindfulness asked me a question, which is wonderful. Thank you, Mindfulness. You say, what do I think of Netanyahu? I don't have opinions on Netanyahu. I think he's doing fine. I think that, you know, I don't know. I think what he was doing with the Supreme Court was basically correct. I think the way that the Israeli Supreme Court was basically just like had God power was absolutely insane. So I think that his fight against that was good. But I don't know a lot about him. I think he's just doing what he can for his country, and his country's interests are not always aligned with American interests. But yeah, I wouldn't be able to speak on Netanyahu. But to
Sorry,
you,
you were making a point right before I
yeah,
dropped,
in the
but
last 5 minutes here, I'm just saying I'm not a moral relativist. I do not think there's
I'm not either.
pure good guys and pure bad guys, but I do think there is a better guy and a worse guy here, and I think it's pretty goddamn obvious, at least to me.
Yeah, I
So
just think it's a bit of a distraction, right? I tend to view it more on like, is this a moral act or is this not a moral act? Not is the
well, if
U.S.
you
good
add
or the
those,
U.S. bad,
well,
right?
if you add those up, you
Sure.
know, you do the math. I think you can have a higher moral value and a lower moral value pretty easily, right?
I think in certain circumstances, yes. It's like it just seems too reductionist to me. But yeah, I could say, okay, cool. If I take the last month as an example, the parameters of my view are the last month.
Yeah,
Hamas has done horrible, tragic terrorist action. Israel's going to defend itself. Cumulatively within that time span, sure, yeah. I mean, I think Israel is justified in doing what
and
they're
also,
doing.
I don't think it's wrong to use the last month. Like again, people will say it's like, oh, you have to contextualize it. And my point is, no, you don't, because the inciting incident was not made necessary by the historical context. They did not have to kill civilians based on the moral context. You could argue they had to fight the IDF military to based on historical context, but
Sure.
the
Yeah.
inciting incident was not made necessary by the historical context. The argument doesn't work. It's really
I just
weird.
I, I just think that it's too low resolution. It can become too low resolution where we're
Yes,
like good
that's
guys, bad guys, right? And then we lose sight of like there's just thousands of people, right, that are in those two buckets that you just created in your mental model of how the world works in this
yeah,
location. And before you know it, we're watching documentaries 20 years later about the thousands of innocent people that died. And that I just, I think it's important to keep the complexity in mind and not
sure,
be
and
too
it's
reductionist.
difficult. Yeah, yeah, and most people can't do both, right? They can't say like, okay, at this point, this person is definitely in the moral right, and then be able to like change their opinion or keep complexity in mind. Keeping those two things in your head at once is not something that most people can do.
I agree. People cannot have a very hard time holding two opposing reality. I don't want to say truths, right? Because I don't want to suggest that truth is purely
Yeah,
subjective. But you know what I mean? Like these
mhm.
two things can be true at the same time, even though they don't feel like they can be sometimes.
Yeah, I definitely agree there. Um, okay, I think we're gonna end it there, right around the hour mark, because that's all I rented this hippie for. So thank you so much for coming on, John Boy. Everybody, thank you for watching. Sorry, slightly scuffed. Again, my life is insane. You have no idea. Slightly scuffed. We will make it better in the future, of course. We will always try to get better. But thank you all for watching. John Boy, thank you so much. I would love to have you on again because the show is better when you're here.
Word.
I mean, I know everybody loves to hear me monologue, but it's better when we're having a talk. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you to our one viewer still here as well. Very epic.
Loyal. Respect.
Yeah. All right, so everybody, Royal Rumbles every Sunday at 8:30 with the whole gang of Pangburn. We have these every Monday. We will be having guests pretty soon, and I'll be having a kind of long-term, long form rather, discussion about abortion with a Tart Vader in a couple weeks here. So look out for that. Thank you all so much for watching. See you all next time. More of ideas. Peace.